The valley held its heat late that year. By the final weeks of August, the corn along the East Road stood tall and dry-edged, the kind of tall that looks healthy from a distance, but sounds papery when the wind moves through it. The creek behind the lower fields had pulled back to a thin thread of itself, and the dust on the county road stayed in the air long after a truck passed, hanging there like it had nowhere better to be. He had lived in this valley long enough to know what that kind of heat meant. Not disaster, not yet. Just the land drawing a long breath before it let go of summer. His farm sat on the western slope, modest and deliberate, the way he was. A white clapboard house with a covered porch. A machine shed, with one wall that leaned slightly, braced by a timber he had sistered against it 12 years ago and never replaced. A kitchen garden gone a little ragged at the edges, and the barn, wood-framed, peeling red paint, wide and solid, its south-facing doors opening toward the longest run of afternoon light in the county. He rose before the sun, as he always had. Bad knees made the first few steps of every morning a negotiation, but he did not linger over it. He pulled on his denim work pants, his worn flannel, his boots, and on mornings that came in cool enough to notice, he took the faded service cap from the hook by the door and settled it over his gray hair without ceremony. His mornings followed an order that had not changed in years. Coffee on the propane burner, a few minutes on the porch listening to the fields before the birds gave them away. Then the slow circuit of chores, chickens, water troughs, a look at the fence line on the north pasture. But lately, something had changed. Not loudly, not in any way that made itself easy to name. It was the kind of change you noticed, the way you notice a lamp has been moved to a different table. The room looks the same, but the light falls differently. He had begun making trips to the barn before sunrise. Not the usual kind, not the quick, purposeful walk of a man checking on something. These trips were slower, heavier. He carried buckets, old 5-gallon plastic ones, the kind that had held paint or feed supplement, and then been kept, because a man like him did not throw out a useful bucket. He carried them one at a time, from a spot behind the machine shed, where a low mound of dark soil had appeared sometime in the past week, and he carried them through the wide south doors of the barn and disappeared inside. He made 4 trips one morning, 6 the next. No one asked him about it yet. There was no reason to ask. He was an old man doing something in his barn before dawn, and the valley had learned, over many years, to leave him to his mornings. That was still about to change. The first time anyone got close enough to see inside those barn doors, it was by accident. A boy from the neighboring property had cut through the field chasing a dog that wasn't his, and he stopped at the edge of the barnyard long enough to watch the old man disappear through the wide south doors with another bucket hanging from each hand. The boy stood there maybe 30 seconds, then ran on. But he told his father at supper, the way children tell things, not as information, just as something strange he had seen, and his father mentioned it the next morning at the feed store, the way men mention things they find mildly amusing, which is to say, without much care, but with enough color that it sticks. By then, the old man had already been at it for 4 days. What was inside those buckets was not a mystery to anyone who had ever kept a garden or turned a field. It was soil, dark, heavy, loam-rich soil from the low spot behind the machine shed, where water sat long enough each spring to leave behind something generous when it finally drained away. He had known about that soil for years. His wife had known about it before him. She had scooped handfuls of it for her window boxes, and he had watched her do it without asking why, because he had already seen what it grew. He was moving it now, one 5-gallon bucket at a time, through the south-facing barn doors and into the long interior shadow of the building, where the afternoon light came in flat and golden and landed against the back wall like something that had been planned. He was building rows, 3 of them running parallel to that wall, framed up with salvaged planks he had pulled from a stack that had been sitting in the corner of the machine shed since longer than he could easily recall. He lined the frames with old feed bags, the heavy woven kind, to keep the soil from bleeding through the gaps. He filled each frame slowly, bucket by bucket, tamping the soil level with the flat of his palm before going back for more. It was the kind of work that unmakes a man's back by the second hour. His knees did not help. He had learned long ago not to argue with his knees, only to negotiate. A short rest on an upturned crate, a hand braced on the wall while he straightened, a pace that was not hurried, because hurry had stopped being useful to him, sometime in a decade he didn't dwell on. A younger man would have found a faster method, or given up by noon and called it impractical. He did neither. By the end of the fourth afternoon, the first row was finished, and level, and full. It ran the length of the wall, solid and dark, and smelling of the kind of earth that wants to be used. He stood in the barn door and looked at it for a long moment before going in to wash his hands. By the second morning after the third row was finished, he was ready to plant. He did not rush to it. He ate his breakfast standing at the kitchen window the way he always did, watching the light come across the fields in its slow, particular way. The kind of light that arrives in late summer with a certain weight to it, golden and slightly tired, as if it already knows what September is going to ask of it. He drank his coffee down to the grounds. He rinsed the cup. Then he went to the shelf above the old work table near the door. Not the barn, but the mudroom shelf, the one with the cracked ceramic rooster and the stack of old almanacs, and the small things he had never been able to move, and he took down the tin. It was an ordinary tin, the kind that had once held hard candies or throat lozenges, small and slightly dented at one corner, with a lid that fit just snugly enough that you had to press and twist. The label was gone. What remained was a strip of masking tape across the top, with 2 words written in a hand that was not his. The handwriting was neat and small and unhurried, the kind of writing that belongs to someone who believed that even ordinary things deserved to be done carefully. He stood with the tin in both hands for a moment longer than was necessary. Then he put it in his shirt pocket and went to the barn. He started at the west end of the first row, kneeling on the piece of folded burlap he had set there for his knees. He opened the tin and looked at the seeds. They were pale, flat, modest-looking things, striped gray and white, the kind you might overlook in a handful. But he knew this variety. He had watched it come up every July for more years than he could count easily. Deep yellow petals with dark centers, big open faces that turned with the day, the kind of flower that makes a yard feel like it is doing well even when other things are not. She had grown them along the south fence every summer. She had saved the seeds herself at the end of each season, dry and careful and methodical, and she had written the year on a new strip of tape each autumn, as if she were logging something important, which she was. He pressed each seed into the soil with his thumb, one at a time, to a depth he did not measure because he had no need to. The spacing came from memory. The pressure came from memory. He worked the full length of the first row without stopping, then moved to the second, then the third. The barn was quiet around him, except for the sound of his breathing and the small compressed sound of each seed finding its place. When the tin was close to empty, he closed it and set it on the wooden frame beside him. He did not put it back in his pocket. He left the tin on the frame because something about setting it down there, in the barn, near the rows he had just finished, felt right. He did not examine the feeling. He stood slowly, knees reporting what they always reported at the end of a long crouch, and he brushed the soil from his hands against his denim and walked out into the afternoon. He needed more soil. He had known this before he started. The 3 rows had taken what he estimated and a little more, and the depth he wanted for the outer plants was not quite what it should be. So the next morning he drove the truck into town, his second supply run in 4 days, and he stopped at the feed store the way he always stopped, quietly, at the counter, with a list written in pencil on the back of an envelope. The young man behind the counter pulled the items, noted them on the account tab the veteran had kept there for 11 years, and said nothing that mattered until the veteran had already turned toward the door. Then the young man looked at the tab again, the potting soil, the peat, the slow-release fertilizer, and 2 weeks prior, a full order of heirloom sunflower seed, and he said something low to the other man stocking shelves near the back. Not loud, not meant for anyone in particular, but feed stores carry sound the way empty barns do. By the time the veteran reached his truck and drove the county road home, the story had already begun moving without him. It did not need much help. A comment at a counter becomes a question. At the gas pump becomes a full account at the diner by supper. The diner sat at the center of the valley, the way a radio tower sits at the center of a signal. Everything passed through it. And the younger farmer who worked the larger spread 2 miles east was there that evening, as he usually was, sitting with 3 other men in the booth nearest the window. And when the story reached him, he did not sit quietly with it, the way some men would have. He laughed. Not unkindly, exactly, or at least not in a way that felt unkind to him, but fully, the way a man laughs when something confirms a thing he already believed. He said what men in diners say, that the old fellow had finally gone soft, that planting flowers in a barn was no kind of farming, that grief did strange things to a man, and maybe it was time someone checked in on him. The others at the table laughed with him. Some laughed less, the way people laugh when they are not certain they should. By morning, the notice board outside the county co-op had a version of it too. Not written, nothing so deliberate as that, but spoken in the parking lot often enough that it might as well have been posted. The valley had heard, the valley had made up its mind. The veteran was back in the barn before sunup, watering. He heard it the way a man hears most things in a valley that small. Not all at once, but in pieces, each one arriving with a different face attached to it. The neighbor who lived half a mile east came by on a Tuesday morning, leaning against the fence post the way men do when they have something to say, but have not decided yet whether to own it. He had a decent enough face, that neighbor, not a cruel man by nature, but he had heard the talk, and the talk had been following him around for days, and he seemed to believe that passing it along with an uncomfortable smile was somehow different from having started it. He said the valley was wondering about the barn. He said some of the men at the diner had been asking questions. He said it with his hands in his pockets and his eyes moving sideways, the way eyes do when a man is embarrassed on behalf of someone he is simultaneously embarrassing. The veteran listened. He let the man finish. He nodded once, the way you nod when you have heard something and chosen not to carry it forward. Then he said he appreciated the visit, and he went back inside. That was the whole of his response. What it cost him to do that, to nod and turn and walk away, was not nothing. There had been a time in his life, younger, before the years had taught him what they had, when he would have had words ready. Not violent words. He had never been that kind of man, but clear ones, precise ones. The kind that let another person know exactly where the line was. He still had those words somewhere inside him. He could feel them now, the way you feel an old injury in cold weather. Not painful exactly, just present, just reminding you it is there. He chose not to use them. Inside the barn, the light was long and even, from the south-facing doors, falling across the 3 rows in that particular late-morning way that made the leaves look almost translucent. He moved through the rows slowly, carrying his watering can, checking each plant with the same unhurried attention he had given them since the beginning. Some were taller than others. A few had begun to show the early tightening at the top that meant a bud was organizing itself beneath the green. He pressed the soil at one plant's base with 2 fingers and found it right. He had learned, in a place and a time he did not often speak about, that there were arguments you won by making them, and arguments you won by not making them at all. The second kind took longer. They required a tolerance for looking foolish that most people were never willing to develop, because most people needed to be understood today, right now, in the present moment, and could not wait. He had learned to wait. The rows stood quietly around him, and he went on watering. The weeks passed the way weeks do in late summer on a working farm. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular fullness of a season that has its own agenda and will not be hurried. Morning after morning he rose before light, worked the yard chores, and then came into the barn to check the rows. By the third week of August, they were knee-high, deep green, the leaves broad and slightly rough to the touch in the way sunflower leaves always were, like they had been made to hold morning dew rather than let it run off. They reached toward the south-facing doors with a steadiness that pleased him, not the frantic reaching of a plant under stress, but the calm inclination of something that had found its direction and intended to keep it. He noticed that the barn itself seemed different with them in it. Warmer, maybe, or simply fuller. The smell had changed, not unpleasantly, just the green smell of growing things mixing with the old wood and dust smell he had always associated with the building. He did not think about it too long. He was not a man who required his feelings to have explanations. One morning in the last week of August, he drove the old truck into town. Not for feed, not for parts. He parked outside the county co-op, went in through the side door, and asked for the woman who ran the market. He had known of her for years, the way you know of anyone in a valley this size. Not well, but enough to trust the basics. She was practical, which was the quality he respected most in people who handled logistics. He did not explain much. He told her he expected to have sunflowers ready for the first weekend of October. He told her he wanted a vendor table, if one was still available. She looked at him for a moment, not unkindly, just with the mild professional assessment of a woman who had heard optimistic promises before, and said there were still 2 tables left on the west end of the market. He took one. He handed her a folded paper with his estimate of available stems and a small deposit in cash, which she wrote a receipt for and gave to him. He folded the receipt and put it in the breast pocket of his jacket, next to nothing in particular, and thanked her, and left. He did not mention it to anyone. There was no one he needed to mention it to, and he had long ago stopped explaining his decisions in advance. Decisions explained in advance invited debate, and debate invited the kind of noise that made it harder to think clearly about the actual work. On the drive home, he listened to the weather report on the AM radio. The forecaster was cheerful and vague about September, the way they always were when the patterns were still shifting, and no one wanted to commit to a number. He turned down the gravel road toward the farm and parked the truck and went back inside the barn to check the rows. The rows were holding. He walked the length of them slowly, the way he always did in the evening when the barn had settled into its particular quiet. The creak of the old wood cooling, the soft shift of dust in the last angle of light coming through the south-facing doors. The plants had put on real height in the past 2 weeks, taller than he had expected them to be at this stage, and the stalks were thick enough now that they stood without the cane supports he had prepared but not yet needed. The heads were still closed, still green-rimmed, still carrying themselves with that particular patience that sunflowers had before they opened, that sense of something waiting to be decided. He checked the soil along the first row with his fingers, the way his wife had taught him, pressing down to the second knuckle and feeling for moisture. Adequate, he added water from the bucket he carried in from the spigot behind the barn, moving steadily from plant to plant without hurry. Outside, down the valley, the fields looked better than they had in years. The warm September had been generous to everyone. The neighboring farms, the larger one to the north especially, had outdoor sunflowers that were already beginning to open, the kind of broad, heavy-headed blooms that photograph well and sell to florists and weekend market buyers without much effort. Anyone driving the county road that week could see them stretching across the fields in long, handsome rows. Gold faces turned east in the mornings, west in the afternoons, working the sky the way healthy sunflowers do. They looked like money. They were supposed to look like money. The men at the diner had been talking about the October market for the past week. with the particular confidence of people who believed the forecast had already been written. He had heard some of it secondhand, through nothing more than the ordinary transfer of conversation that happens in a small valley where everyone buys feed from the same store. The numbers being discussed were optimistic. The mood was easy and a little loud. His own barn was visible from the county road, if you looked. The south-facing doors stood open most days while the weather held, and the rows of tall yellow inside were not exactly hidden. They simply were what they were, bright and warm against the dark interior, like something cheerful occupying a room where it did not quite belong. Drivers slowed sometimes. He had noticed that, from the porch, they slowed, and then they went on, because there was nothing in the sight that required stopping. A man growing flowers in his barn. Strange, perhaps, but harmless. Something to mention at the diner, the way you might mention an unusual cloud formation. A brief curiosity, not a serious thing. He finished watering the last row and carried the empty bucket back to the door, and stood for a moment looking out at the valley, going amber in the late light. The heads were almost ready to open. The radio woke before he did, the way it always had. The volume set low enough to be mistaken for weather itself. A murmur of static and voices that drifted through the barn's side wall, where the old AM set sat on a shelf, between a coffee can of nails and a folded grain sack. He had slept poorly, which was not unusual. His knees had been talking in the night, the left one more than the right, and he had risen twice to stand at the window, the way a man does when sleep won't hold him, looking out at the dark valley, not because he expected to see anything, but because standing helped, and the dark was a kind of company. By the time the announcer's voice sharpened into something intelligible, he was already in the barn. He had a habit of early mornings that had nothing to do with ambition and everything to do with the particular shape of a long life, the body rising before the mind finished resting, carrying him through the familiar motions, almost without consultation. He had filled the watering tin. He had walked the first row, touching one of the broad, dark centers the way you might press the back of your hand to a child's forehead. The heads were open now, all of them, the yellow petals sitting loose and wide in the dim interior, catching the first gray light that came under the barn doors. The announcer said the words plainly. Clear skies tonight, temperatures dropping through the upper 20s by morning, possibly lower in low-lying valley areas. Frost advisory through Saturday. Winds calm. He listened the way a man listens to news he has already half-formed in his own mind, not with surprise, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the quiet settling that comes when an expectation is confirmed. He set down the tin. He stood in the center of the barn aisle for a moment, looking up the south-facing wall at the 3 rows of yellow, standing full and still in the early air. Then he walked to the doors. They were wide, hinged barn doors with iron hardware that had gone stiff through years of standing open, and he had to work both latches with both hands, leaning into each one in turn. The hinges moved with resistance, as if questioning the decision, and then gave. He brought the left door first, slowly, walking it shut on its runners, then the right, until they met in the middle, with a sound like a period at the end of a long sentence. He dropped the crossbar into its bracket. He stood back. Inside now, in the sealed warmth of the barn, the sunflowers were invisible. They existed behind wood and old iron and the gathered heat of weeks, and the world outside had no way to reach them. The cold was coming down the mountain the way it always did, without apology, without announcement except the radios, and it would arrive by morning. He picked up the watering tin again. He set the tin down just inside the side door and went back to the house. The night came in stages, the way cold nights do in that valley. First, a stillness that settled over the fields like something placed there with care. Then, a gradual hardening of the air, the temperature dropping in small increments that a thermometer on a porch post recorded, but no one stayed up to watch. No, the stars were sharp, the kind of sharp that means no cloud cover, no insulation, nothing between the sky and the earth but open cold. By midnight, the frost had begun to form on the grass, on fence rails, on the roofs of trucks parked in yards up and down the valley road. It did not announce itself. It simply accumulated, the way debt does, quietly and without drama, until morning made it visible. He slept the way men who have learned to sleep through uncertainty sleep, not deeply, but fully, with a kind of trained trust that the body would rest as much as it needed, and no more. He woke before light, the way he always did. The bedroom was cold in the corners. He dressed without turning on a lamp, moving by the arrangement of things he had memorized long before, and went to the kitchen and lit the burner under the kettle. He did not go to the barn first. He stood at the kitchen window. The valley was pale. The frost had gone to white in the pastures, a flat, even white that read almost like snow, until the light came up enough to distinguish it, granular, fragile, sitting on blade and stem alike. The outdoor sunflower rose across the road. On the neighboring field were visible from where he stood, a long dark band against the white ground, and even from that distance, something about them looked different than it had the evening before, heavier, lower. The stems had not fallen, but they had bent in the night, as if whatever had been holding them upright had softened, and the heads, the wide, open-faced heads that had been reaching all autumn, were tilted now, turned inward, the outer petals curled against themselves the way fingers curl when warmth leaves them. He watched the light come up over the ridge and spread across the valley floor, and as it did, the damage became clearer. The petals along the outer rows had gone dark at the edges, a bruised and olive color that no sunflower shows when it is well. It moved inward, row by row, the way a tide retreats, not sudden, just inevitable. The plants were still standing, but they were not the same plants they had been yesterday. Something had gone out of them in the night, some essential quality the frost had taken without leaving a receipt. The kettle began to sound on the burner. He turned the burner off before the kettle could reach a full whistle and set it aside. He did not pour the water yet. He pulled on the denim jacket first, the one he kept on the peg by the back door, and then the service cap, because the cold would still be sharp this early, and then his boots, which took him a moment at the laces. His knees had not improved overnight. He went out through the back and around the side of the house the long way, as he always did in the morning, past the garden bed where the last of the season's stragglers had given up weeks ago, and across the gravel toward the barn. His breath made small, pale shapes in the air that vanished before they rose, more than a foot. The ground was solid where it had been soft the evening before. The frost had been thorough. He unlatched the barn door and pulled it open, first one, then the other, and the residual warmth from inside moved against his face. Not a wave of heat, just a gentleness, a slight easing of the cold, the way a room smells like someone who was just there. He stepped into the doorway and stopped. They were all standing, all 40 of them along the south interior wall, the 3 rows of raised planting beds he had built from salvaged planks and old feed liners over the course of those slow August mornings. The deep yellow petals were open and broad in the morning light coming through the doors, the dark centers facing forward the way they always faced the strongest source of warmth, and there was not a curled petal, not a bruised edge, not a single stem that had softened or bent. They were exactly as he had left them. He stood there a while, not a long while, not the kind of standing a man does when he is making something of a moment, just the ordinary pause of a man who has walked into a place and found it as he expected, and is taking a breath before the work begins. A crow called once out past the east field. He heard it and did not look toward it. Then he moved inside, pulled the doors to against the morning cold, not all the way, enough to hold the warmth, and began his regular chores. He checked the water in the planters. He pressed his fingers into the soil of the middle row to feel the moisture, the way he had done each morning since August. He noted in no particular way, to no one, that the plants had come through the night without injury. He did not say it aloud. He simply noticed it, the way a man notices when a thing he trusted has held. And then he kept moving. The kettle was still waiting on the stove. The kettle was still warm when the first truck came up the county road. He heard it before he saw it, the particular sound of an engine that had been idling longer than necessary, the kind of slow approach a man makes when he is not entirely sure he should be coming at all. He was at the stove, pouring water into his tin cup, and he did not move to the window. He simply waited, the way he had always waited, for things that were going to arrive whether he went toward them or not. The younger farmer, the one with the newer equipment and the loud opinions, parked at the far end of the gravel drive and did not get out right away. When he finally stepped down from his cab, he stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the barn. Not at the house, the barn. He stood there long enough that a man watching from inside would have had time to finish a full cup of coffee, which is almost exactly how long it took. The veteran set down his cup and walked out. They stood at the fence, and the younger man looked at the ground for a moment before looking up. There were no words right away. That was something the veteran had learned to leave room for, the space a proud man needs before he can speak plainly. The frost had taken the younger farm's sunflowers down to the stem, 2 rows along the south field, planted early and staked carefully, all of it gone soft and brown by morning. A season's work for the market. Gone. The younger man finally said something simple, said he hadn't understood what the barn was for. Said he understood now. The veteran nodded once. Didn't make more of it than that. By mid-morning, 2 others had come. Not to talk much, just to stand near the fence and look at the barn doors, which he had opened wide by then, to let the light fall across the rows. The sunflowers were at full face, broad and yellow, pointing toward the south wall light the way they always had, unhurried and unbroken. 40 plants, 3 long rows, exactly as planted. He went inside and began the work he had already planned. He took his cutting knife from the shelf, the old one, short-handled, kept sharp, and moved down the rows steadily, choosing the stems that were fully open, cutting each one at a clean angle, the way his wife had shown him once in the garden. He wrapped them in brown paper in groups of 6, folded the ends tight against the morning damp, and stacked them carefully in the wooden crates he had lined up along the barn wall 2 days before. He was almost ready. He drove in before the other vendors had finished setting up their tables. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of October morning that arrives without apology, and the fairground lot was still half empty when he pulled his truck through the gate and back toward his reserved space near the co-op barn. The woman who ran the market was already there. She helped him carry the first crates without being asked, and neither of them said much. He unfolded his table, set the crates on it, and began standing the wrapped bundles upright in the tin buckets he had brought, each one holding an inch of water at the bottom. 40 stems, give or take the few he had kept back. The sunflowers opened in the morning air like they had been waiting for it. By the time the market opened, word had already moved through the lot. People stopped before they bought anything else. Some stood at a distance and looked, the way a person looks at something that corrects them without speaking. The neighboring farmer came through the gate an hour in, without his truck, without anything to sell. He walked to the table and stood there for a moment. Then he chose a bundle, counted out the coins, and handed them across, without raising his eyes all the way. The veteran took the money and made change from a small tin he kept in his jacket pocket. He didn't offer anything extra. He didn't need to. Others came the same way. Some were strangers who only needed flowers and didn't know the story behind them, and that was fine. They were treated the same. Some were neighbors who knew exactly where those sunflowers had been growing for the past 6 weeks, and were only now fully understanding what they had been looking at. The veteran sold each bundle at the same fair price, made change when needed, and thanked people quietly when they thanked him. He was sold out before noon. He drove home through the valley in the pale midday light. The empty crates stacked in the truck bed, the buckets rattling softly against each other. He pulled into the farmyard and sat for a moment before getting out. The barn doors were still open from the morning. The rows were mostly cut now, a few late-facing blooms still standing in the filtered light. He went to the porch. He set water on, poured his cup, and sat down in the old chair that had been there long enough to hold the shape of the years. The road was empty. The valley had gone quiet again, the way valleys do when something has passed through and settled. He held the cup in both hands and let the warmth come through. He didn't need the road to answer. He already knew what the land had said.